instead of the screen itself. It's kind of grayed out. It says grayed out on the start desktop, but I'll tell you what, let me just do the slides for now and then we can carry on.
Anything yet?
No, I definitely can't do the desktop share.
Oh.
It doesn't seem to like that. Well, I'll tell you what I'll do. This is one of those days, isn't it?
So it would seem. I wonder if there's anything I can do for my, I can make you an administrator. Not sure that actually helps.
Maybe.
What browser are you in?
I'm in Firefox at the moment.
I think it likes Chrome the best.
Okay, give me 2 seconds. Let me flick over to here. We have the technology, as they say. I'll just have to like sing.
Those of you who just joined us, bear with us a moment. We're trying to get the screen sharing working here. Everything done in the browser sounds really great until you start having technical issues, and then you wish for a desktop client again.
Yeah, you do.
I see that Mr. McCollum has joined us. He may or may not be on audio. Ah, he says he is bereft of audio. Understood. Yeah, Kevin, if it were only that easy. The Teams functionality is extremely limited and certainly does not have all the pieces that we need to effectively run a webinar. Stream is great for just doing videos and broadcasting videos, but lacks a whole bunch of features, the Q&As and polls and handouts and all the various marketing integrations. So I assure you that we looked at all of those options, but just wasn't there. Unfortunately, much to Mr. Webb's chagrin, who desperately wants us to use Teams for everything. Any luck there, Liam, at all?
Fine. It's moaning about Chrome.
The one that usually works.
Yeah, it tells me weirdly that I have an out of date, which I don't.
For shame.
Yeah.
You go, oh, it gave me a similar message, and I just clicked past it.
Yeah. Let me try this again. Audio.
Right. Well, have patience, everyone. We will resolve these technical issues here soon, hopefully. We'll at least let you share your PowerPoint and or
I'm just gonna do that.
browser. I could try making you an admin. I'm not sure it would help.
Yeah, so I uploaded.
Oh, did you upload something? Oh, I'm not seeing it.
Ooh.
There we go. I went ahead and made you an admin.
Okay, so that I don't
and now we're seeing your slides. Very good.
I think that might just be what I uploaded. Let me just check.
Whoop. Now they're gone.
Yeah, so I'm not going to be able to share the screen, but we can do the slides though.
Yeah, let's at least do the slides.
Okay.
This is my way of keeping Liam on time by forcing him to only cover slides.
Yeah, it's going to be complicated. I'm sure we can make it work though.
Yeah, so we had your slides for a minute, or a few seconds anyway.
It's still doing like an upload thing, and then it should. It should work.
There we are.
Okay, so you should have slides.
We do indeed.
Oh, I can click through them too. Perfect. It's lost some of the color, but well, we'll move on. It's fine. Okay. It'll be slides as it is, so that means I have my limited time now, but that works perfectly fine. You did this on purpose, didn't you?
All part of my cunning plan.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm excited to kind of present to you today. Obviously, we're just going to do slides, but that should be fine, and I can talk real-world bits and pieces, and as you'll see, my colors have not quite worked out the way I was expecting. But we're going to talk about Office 365 application security. And for those that don't know me, oh, it came back to the first slide. Let's go back. For those that don't know me, this is me. As a background for you guys, I obviously am not from Virginia, weirdly, and not from even from West Virginia. I'm actually from the UK, which is where I met Eric all those years ago. And I moved out here to the US, live outside DC, just in the Blue Ridge Mountains, so I can hear the banjos playing at night. But I work out here. I now officially work for myself as of last year. I've worked in consulting and security and all kinds of different things over the years. But this is me. I work for my own company called SharePoint. I'm a Microsoft MVP guy. And one of the things that I enjoy doing is creating training courses. And so I have a whole bunch of them on Pluralsight and Opsagility. And I also have some courses that will come out on LinkedIn as well. So if you want to reach out to me, feel free. I've put my SharePoint details and my Hello, It's Liam. So if you don't recognize me as SharePoint, I am the Hello, It's Liam guy. So that's me. So there you go. That was short and sweet. So what we're going to talk about is 4 specific areas. And these are kind of core buckets that I want to focus on. And you'll have to bear with my slides, how they've lost weird colors now. But the first area we're going to focus on, when we talk about application security, we need to talk about securing access within Office 365 to begin with. And then, of course, once we've identified and figured out the way we're going to do that, then we'll move over to controlling the data flow. One of the biggest conversations that I have as I'm consulting with clients is how the data flows in and out of the organization, and even inside the organization between departments too. And then, of course, we'll talk about protecting data. That's obviously an important one. And then also protecting from malicious types of attacks that are actually quite common. So one of the first questions I always tend to ask at this point, obviously I don't need your feedback, but is a question around whether people actually think Office 365 is secure. And the reason I ask that question is because it's interesting to me, the perception that everybody has of whether they think Office 365 or the Microsoft 365 cloud in general is secure as you would expect it to be. And actually working on some research projects over this past year with some fellow people that, some friends of mine, we actually did a research paper and came back with the results that I kind of expected, that actually most people say no, and then there's a few people that say yes. And then actually as we delve deeper, one of the biggest issues is that people don't actually know necessarily what's there or more importantly, they haven't paid the extra to buy the license and enable them. And so I'll kind of talk about that as we go through the process. So the first thing I wanted to ask was, what is an application? Because that is the first question. I talk about application security, but what does that really mean? Are we talking about an app, an add-in? Are we talking about like an Office application installed on my machine? And of course, I thought this picture was appropriate because when I asked my kids what that is, they're not quite sure what to do with it. But of course, those were the most amazing telephones ever. So what is an application? Well, in one sentence, an application, often shortened to an app, is something that allows end users to perform a particular function. And I want you to think of that and remember that as the key phrase that comes out of today, is that an application is something that allows end users to perform a function. That does not mean it can be a fully fledged application like Word or Excel or something like that, or SharePoint Online. It could be anything that allows the end user to fulfill their job and the thing that they're trying to achieve. And that's a mind shift that we have to get into, because too often when I talk about application security, people talk about specific applications that they buy, or how do I protect, macros in Excel or things like that. But what about things that people put into a SharePoint site, or things that go into a Teams, or something that goes into OneDrive, or any other kind of cloud service application that you're using? So when we talk about kind of Office 365 specifically, then when we think of an application, I think of these four things, because I don't think of the applications themselves, which is kind of the irony. If you put your dev hat on, I suppose if you ask IT pros versus dev, like if I came to Eric as a dev and said, hey, tell him what an application would be, he'd be like, well, it could be this, it could be that, it could be an add-in, SharePoint framework, all those things, because as a dev, like our model is always, it's something that we've developed. It's an add-in or something we've added to a SharePoint site or a team. Whereas often an application is just something that's installed. But at least for the purposes of this, an application for me fits into these four blocks. So it's either going to be an add-in. So obviously Microsoft had that whole realm of that you build add-ins, manage code, full trust, or all that kind of stuff that went in. And then they moved across to those add-ins or apps that they would build. And so that was one type of application. The second one is obviously more prevalent now, which is the SharePoint framework, which is quite common and actually seems to be more common than I originally thought it would be, as far as organizations that are willing to build something. What I tend to find is that people are willing to go SharePoint framework when you tell them that they can't use master pages in modern UI. Then they're all over SharePoint framework to do extensions and brand and all those things that you can't do without having a master page. And then, of course, we have ad hoc scripts. And you may not think that's an application, but truly that is the definition of an application, of a business user who wants something to happen in the site, the library, the list, whatever it would be, and they can't get it to do it, and they can't build a workflow, or they don't have PowerApps and Flow, and they read a blog site where some guy wrote, 500 lines of JavaScript and had a pretty picture that said when they put it on a page, it did this. So they copy it and paste it into a web part on a page. Normally a content editor web part, if you're using kind of regular SharePoint stuff, or even a script editor web part. And I know you're going to say, well, there's a modern, you can't do that. Well, actually we can. And so people still do that. And then, of course, we have Flow and PowerApps. Flow and PowerApps for me being the new boys on the block type thing, where they are intrinsically integrated now into the SharePoint stack. And so now, outside of not licensing end users will start to build. I even had a call previous to this where I was talking to somebody on the call and said one of the things that I found is people are building Power Apps. They're building Power Apps all the time. They are hideous, absolutely hideous, because the people that are building them are not UX guys. They're just people building an application that they want to build, and the colors are weird. But there you go. So I digress on that. But applications fall into these four blocks for me. So when we talk about these kind of applications, we need to obviously focus on how we secure everything first. So the good news is that Office 365 or Microsoft 365, or even most cloud providers at that point, are private. That's the whole point behind them. Even though you can share something, they are built to be private. So you have to have credentials to get into the system. So when we look at access control, which is our first block, so when we think about application security, think about access control first. So of course, we have these 4 pillars of account types. Our first one will be on-premises Active Directory. That's the standard, true test. It's been tried. You put accounts in AD, you assign them access to the applications, and off they go and get access. Then, of course, when we jump into the Azure AD, Office 365 type process, then we're talking about cloud accounts, maybe external guest accounts, or maybe even federated accounts. And I'm not talking federated to organizations. Maybe it is, but federated to internal Microsoft. So federated from the regular Azure AD authentication to what used to be the Windows Live infrastructure, where any email address, as long as it's converted to a live ID, can then be used to come across as needed. So those are the 4 blocks. So determining how people come in and how we authenticate and where they come from, for me, is pillar number 1. So internally, they're going to be on-premises ADs if you're synchronizing to the cloud. But then, of course, when you're bringing external people in, where are they coming from? Are they just cloud accounts? Are they Azure B2B? Are they just added in with external sharing? Or are they federated accounts? Understanding that principle, one of the first questions I ask often when I come into an organization is draw on the whiteboard the type of accounts that come into your SharePoint or your 365 environment. Tell me how they get in and who looks after them, if you assign passwords to them, and then tell me why they're coming in and when they come in. Now, of course, if you think that through, that's actually quite a lot of information to try and to know, like, why are they coming in? When are they coming in? Where are they coming in from? So protecting our application starts by figuring out how we authenticate them in. Now, of course, our 365 authentication process, obviously my slide looks random because there's no transitions now, but the user navigates to an Office 365 site or service, and then based on whether they're a cloud account, an external account, or an on-premises account, will dictate how they gain access to that. So in a regular authentication process, if I'm a cloud account, I get prompted straight with the Office 365 login. I put the, liam@company.com and put my password in, and hey presto, I get access granted or denied at that point. If I'm an external account that's been added and I'm going to be externally authenticating to something else, so maybe this is going out to the Windows Live ID provider, then what's happening here is I type in my external account, so Liam@Yahoo, let's say. It then recognizes that I don't actually exist in the Azure AD as a normal user. So I then get thrown out to authenticate externally. I go through that authentication process, and then I get access granted or denied. And then, of course, for on-premises, depending on how we're doing that process, if it's password hash, single sign-on, whether it's ADFS or something else, then, of course, we have on-premises accounts, and then you authenticate all the way through. So, of course, fundamentally, the authentication process is really similar, irrelevant of which process you come in by. Now, of course, to make things more secure, we drop other bits and pieces into there, like multi-factor authentication or conditional access policies and things like that, which we'll talk about in a minute. But those come in to protect the authentication into the application itself. Too often what happens is people often get granted to applications because we're all supposed to use AD accounts and we're all supposed to put them into groups and all this kind of fun stuff. And actually, recently, I'm doing an audit for a company here in the US and on their 365 environment. And it's quite strange to see the amount of Office 365 groups that have actually been created. So I'm asking them about site collections and things like that. And they say, oh, we use Office 365 groups. And they have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. And so I asked them a question and said, can you tell me why you're using Office 365 groups and not just SharePoint site collections? And they honestly had no idea. They had no idea why they were using those instead of using site collections. If somebody told them that's what they should use. And so that's what they're using. And all of the pieces that come with that, all of the underpinning that gets created under the covers that nobody ever sorts out and cleans out. So it's important to understand that. So how do we secure the access coming in? Number one, set up multi-factor authentication. I was called to speak to a couple of organizations out in DC who'd been breached in Office 365. Fundamentally, if they had multi-factor authentication enabled, it would never have happened, ever. Just Categorically never happened. I also found in organizations that actually they're not doing the same best practices as you would have on premises in the cloud. Best practice on premises is that from an administrator perspective, that you have separate admin accounts for management of your SharePoint infrastructure, your servers, etc. What's happening in the cloud is it's very rare that I often find organizations that have also moved those admin accounts and they're actively using those to manage the 365 tenant. So what I find is you have an IT group that has regular accounts, admin accounts on premises. They all get transferred to the cloud, but the global admins are the regular accounts, which kind of makes no sense. It's kind of like, it's a little bit weird because then what you've done is taken a regular account and elevated it up in Office 365 for no apparent reason when that normal account can't do anything on premises, but now you've elevated it to do more in the cloud. So it should be back the other way, use the admin ones. We also need to define anti-malware policies. Obviously, Microsoft does a really good job at protecting some of this, but you need to go and define the policies that might be needed, because when we're protecting access, sometimes the access is granted because we're sharing files or moving things around. Malware policies will protect from that. And then, of course, block auto forwarding of emails. That one's a given. That one's actually quite an important attack vector that's being used quite frequently. When people breach Office 365, which is normally done by bad passwords, and they breach in and then do phishing scams inside 365, what they're doing is they're creating forwarding emails to make copies of all the emails and the data that goes backwards and forwards. So if you disable that, then nobody can create forwarding rules if there's in the event of a breach. Obviously, you also need to secure Office message encryption, so encrypt the data that goes backwards and forwards, define your phishing and spam policies, implement your ATP, save attachments and links. And then for me, the second big one here is conditional access policies. Define a policy that would control how someone gets into the organization. Because if you take the example of the organization I was working with that had a breach, if they'd done multi-factor, it would have fixed it. If they hadn't had multi-factor, then of course, conditional access policies could have actually fixed that for them. Because after doing some investigation, we found that the hackers were sitting in Nigeria, they were coming in, and actually, if you speak to anybody who works in security, they'll tend to tell you where the bulk of the phishing attacks are coming from, and the hacker attacks are coming. So that's one of the first things to do, have a conditional access policy that defines the boundary of when people connect in. So can they connect in from outside the US? Can they connect from specific countries around the world? Do they have to have specific types of devices, or are we forcing multi-factor at that point? So those are things that you need to do as part of the securing the access of the data. Now, from a conditional aspect, my slides look awful like this. From a conditional access policy perspective, the user repeats the process as before. They navigate to 365, and right at the point as they authenticate, conditional access policies obviously kick in. If we look at the top option, it's going to validate if they're a member of a specific group and are they coming in from an approved location. An approved location could be subnets and IP ranges, or it could be countries or geographic areas, and then their access is granted. On the flip side of that, we could be checking, well, are they a member and are they coming in for an approved device? Because your organization may not utilize bring your own device or BYOD. You may have to have a issued device to get into the organization. And so at that point, I would get blocked because I'm trying to connect from my cell phone. There isn't an approved device. And so I get blocked at that point. In a recent audit that I did, probably the back end of last year, working with a large hotel chain, one of the things that came out of that when we did some checks is they didn't utilize conditional access policies. They had some levels of multi-factor for admin, but not for anybody else. And more importantly, they hadn't really figured out and controlled how people were connecting in. And so when I looked in the system, the top 2 items that were connected, that were non-sanctioned, I should say, that were connected to Office 365 were Amazon Alexa devices. And so when we checked and delved deeper, these were some of the VPs in the organization that obviously had connected Amazon Alexa to their email so that they could talk to it and say, Alexa, create me an email, blah, 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 blah. I mean, sounds pretty cool, like nice and futuristic, but unsanctioned nonetheless. And so those are the things that these types of policies, as well as cloud app security, will help us to overcome. Okay, so we protected the access, we blocked the end users coming in, or we allowed them, we forced them to do multi-factor, we forced them to be in geographic locations. So the next thing is, well, how do we ring fence the data? How do we control the data flow to the point where we know when it's leaving the organization or not, or what can we actually do to protect from that? So the first thing is to understand the data flow itself. So first one is obviously, no matter what anybody says about, I only use SharePoint, I only use OneDrive. Firstly, you're lying, because we all use email and we always send attachments. I've worked in SharePoint. Let's have a think. I worked with SharePoint before SharePoint Server 2001 came out. So before it had the name SharePoint. So I was actually working at the Microsoft campus in the UK, actually helping the team test early versions of SharePoint 2001. And even then, it was still the same. People would send everything via email. And I've been working with it for that long, and yet I still prefer to send attachments via email. I know that sounds really bad, but it's just a habit. It's been my life, and that's what I do. Except I do use some of the file sharing services, and that's normally for larger files. So at least I have that balance. I have large files, go here, smaller files, just stick in an email, because it's easy. And it's the out-of-band communication, because I don't want to keep talking to people constantly. I don't want to have Teams chats, because I have way too many things in my life to worry about than answer 5 million chats that keep popping up. So I use out-of-band, I send an email, and then you can respond to it whenever you feel like it. But functionally, that's quite dangerous, because now that means as IT, I need to now protect for that. I need to make sure that you're not sending PII data or something else outside the organization. I have to do something to it. The second thing is we also have to protect from the data that's been uploaded into the site. Now, of course, years ago when SharePoint was on premises, there was the antivirus vendors made SharePoint products, which are still kind of around, and that was to help protect, documents being uploaded and things like that. And then, of course, we moved to the cloud now, but we still need to protect what's being uploaded into the system. Now, Microsoft do a great job. They do scan things that go in and out. And hopefully in your organization, you have something that probably would have caught something that was malicious before it even went up there. But when you start to share things externally, when you allow people that you don't know what device they're coming in from, you don't know what they're connected to, then that can be a problem, because you don't know what they're uploading. We also need to focus on internal and external sharing. So what's being shared externally? Is it sensitive data? Is it trade secrets? Is it PII data? Or is it just pictures of a Christmas party or something silly that's gone? You need to identify and protect from that going. And then, of course, importantly, is consume data. So stuff that's being used by, for example, Flow and PowerApps, being able to identify, okay, well, this flow needs to use some connectors to do something. How can I ensure that that's not going to leave the organization? Because as much as Flow and PowerApps are great, and I think they're great, one of the difficulties that you've got is being able to protect a normal end user from sharing something via Flow or PowerApps without the protections in place. So if we talk about PowerApps, and I kind of want to talk about this because this is kind of the first bit that Microsoft have gone into with the whole PowerApps and Flow, is the implementation of data groups. So data groups let you kind of define what's allowed to access business data and what's denied access to business data. Now, of course, this is done at the PowerApps administration screen, where you're able to go in and say, for my organization or this group or whatever it would be inside PowerApps, I'm going to let these specific connectors that we wish to use, and I'm going to deny them access to the business data. So like your real world example would be, let's say that you had a Microsoft Flow that every time it did something, you wanted it to send something out to Twitter for some reason, because we all like to be social and put something out there. So one of the things that we can do here is be able to go in and say, block any business data from being consumed out, for example, in Twitter. So you can say, I'm going to put Twitter in the denied access section, And then at that point, when the connector's used by a flow or PowerApps, they're no longer able to consume that data. And of course, it'll present an error back to the user to say, when they go back in to look at it, it'll say, you're using unsanctioned, it shouldn't be used, and explain why that wouldn't happen. Now, it doesn't go super deep. It doesn't do lots of what we hope will happen when flow and PowerApps becomes more mature. So just be aware. I mean, you're still able to circumvent pieces like this. For example, if we're using the connectors, or I can do a RESTful API call inside of Flow and things like that. And there's lots of ways around being able to gain access to the data. And the bad news is that for end users are pretty good at figuring out ways around. I mean, I remember years ago working in a bunker in London underneath Scotland Yard, doing some work for them with one of the units there. And they needed to share data with another police unit that was actually in Scotland. And there was no physical way for them to do that, because back then on their desk, each person had 4 computers that were for different classifications of content and security in different networks. Yet some smart person in there figured out, and this will be a blast from the past for some of you, that there was this product called Groove that they could somehow get onto a machine, and then they could sync it all outside the network and have the other guys in Scotland pick it up. And we eventually found it, but they just figured it out. It was just, we could just use that. And that's what they did. End users will always find a way around it. And so putting these things in place now before they start building, and then notifying them that, hey, you need to, these are the connections that you can't use, that will help as you go forward. Now, of course, what about these ones? This is one of the areas where I've spent quite a bit of my time playing over the past year or so, is really around this idea of scripts, add-ins, and then SharePoint framework. And so when you think of an add-in, to get an add-in into 365, it goes through, for example, the Microsoft Store, it's managed at deployment, and you cross your fingers and hope that it's good code, that it's not going to do anything malicious. But you have no idea. I mean, honestly, you have no idea. If I built an add-in and sold it to you, I could tell you, yeah, it does nothing malicious. All it does is does what I say. But actually, it could do a whole bunch of stuff, and you would have no idea. But then, of course, you've got these connected applications like I just talked about, so Flow and PowerApps, where we can use those data loss prevention policies to kind of ring fence the data. But then you've got SharePoint Framework, but you say SharePoint Framework is new and special and it's protected. It is. But actually, you don't know what the SharePoint Framework's doing either. So I'll give you a real world. I was working with a client, large global organization. Each of the departments in the organization had their own site collection that was given to them inside their vast 365 tenant. And they came to us and said, hey, can you brand it for us? And yes, build some web parts. And so we built some SharePoint Framework web parts, built some UI components, the whole thing. And then I reached out to them and said, we need to deploy the framework components. And they said, well, we can't do that. You have to speak to the guy who's in global head IT. I was like, oh, okay. So they put me in contact. So I reached out to the global IT and I said, I've got some SharePoint Framework components. There's a bunch of JavaScript files and some package stuff needs to be uploaded. And he's like, okay, let's get on a WebEx. So I got on a WebEx. I sent him the stuff. He uploaded it for me. He enabled it. When the box popped up and said, do you trust? He pressed trust and done. That was literally the conversation and the process. There was no conversation in there about, well, what does the code do? Can you tell me what permissions it might need? He didn't even read the box that popped up. He just pressed trust and we were good to go. That's one of the problems that we see, is that. And then, of course, this ad hoc script, no protection whatsoever. And you may think there's protection in the modern because obviously some of the components are not available. But of course, there's a link right here to the GitHub, to the React script editor web part, which I continue to find in multiple tenants, where people were used to putting JavaScript in the pages. You can put the script editor web part on a page in the modern, and you can execute JavaScript at that point. But you may wonder, well, what's the problem with that? Well, let's do this. So I've got 2 pieces of JavaScript here. And if I could have shared it, I would have showed you what they would have done. This is just 3 lines of the whole thing. It's about 1,000 lines. But that's functional JavaScript. It's called test1, and that's my function. Now, you may not know what that does, but trust me, that executes in the browser perfectly fine. And then if we look at this one here, for example, test2, really simple JavaScript, nothing special. All I'm doing here is creating an image tag. I'm setting it so it's got no display. I'm giving it an ID, and then I'm setting the source of the image to a piece of JavaScript. Then I'm appending the body of it with the image, and then I'm grabbing the image by the ID, and then I'm being naughty here and using eval, and then I'm getting the image source and then launching it. That works perfectly fine. Just drop it in a Chrome thing and load it in the browser, and that will spawn a hidden image into the page. Now, you may think there's nothing malicious with that. Well, I mean, not really. It's just an alert box that pops up. But I spent some time creating lots and lots of these different types of things and putting them inside SharePoint framework projects. So I created a SharePoint framework project and then created a whole bunch of JavaScript that did things like this. And then I tested it inside the modern UI so that when you put the SharePoint framework on the page, it's a web part, it looks fantastic. But if you look through the source, you can see there's malicious code. It was obfuscated code. It was calling external components. It was doing all kinds of different things. And that's because it's not protected. And so then there's a whole bunch of other things you have to do, for example, around policies to try and block access to external, using proxy type capabilities to protect. But this is still one of the most common issues that I find is people not writing great JavaScript or TypeScript for that fact, and it doing something horrible to the UI. At least these are not that malicious. They just spawn message boxes, but it does give you an idea of kind of what people would do. Well, at least what I would do. So how do you protect the data then? So we've got protection at the door. We've got protection as data is going backwards and forwards. So how do we protect the data itself? Well, the good news is the first place is encryption. So there are two types of encryption that go on in Microsoft 365. You've got volume level encryption, which runs for everything. Microsoft take care of that. And then you have service level encryption, which is Exchange Online, Skype, SharePoint, blah, blah, blah. So service based. Obviously, it's encryption in transit. So client machine communicates to the 365 servers. And I said server because that's what you're actually communicating to is a load balanced set of servers. Then there's encryption between the 365 servers to another server and then 365 to non-365 servers. So that's all baked in. So those top two, nothing you have to do, it's there. Now, for the content, the next ones are you. How do you encrypt the content? Because we're not on premises now, so we're not storing stuff in SQL and having to do, transparent data encryption and things like that. We're going to be using information rights management to apply policies, stop people forwarding, printing, etc. Advanced information protection or Azure information protection, Office message encryption, and then obviously S-MIME, which has been around for quite a while. But those four pieces will be the way that you can encrypt the content to ensure that if the content leaves the organization, so think the process through for a second. So I know someone's going to say, yeah, but we've got data loss prevention or unified DLP, and we can identify this content. But yes, but there's a small window where it doesn't get picked up. So realistically, I could upload a file full of credit card numbers from the organization into a SharePoint online site and share it within 30 seconds, and it will beat the DLP picking it up. Because the DLP is not fast enough. It's not going to be real time to capture that. So I can share that. Now, it will capture it, but I will have already done it, and then I could unshare it after that, or I could just delete it once I know the other person's got it. So there's some limits here that we need to live within. But actually, we can fix this by using these capabilities. So I can say advanced information protection, for example, install the toolbar into Office across the company, have some policies, and then at the moment that I paste a credit card number in, it's going to classify the content automatically for me. Now, information management policies. So if we're using IRM, we enable these obviously at the SharePoint Admin Center. At some point, they might make it look more modern, but that's the standard view that's there. Obviously, we can apply the policies within the document libraries, and these are tied to the library level at that setting. And you can see from the screenshot, we can allow people to print or not print or run scripts, etc. And we can apply group restrictions at that point. We can also, from the Office client itself, create ad hoc policies. And then if we're talking about Exchange email, So number one in that list of protecting the data that leaves the organization, which is email, we're able to apply templates within the Outlook client. We can have them appear in mail transport rules, and we can also use protection rules that used to be in previous versions of Office. So we can capture the data as it's leaving the organization. Because remember, when you think about security, it's not called like offensive security. It's not made up. It's because that's what it is. You're constantly trying to protect what somebody might do, and often not maliciously. It may just be that they sent it and didn't even think. So AIP is obviously the new boy on the town, or at least what will become unified labels going forward. But here we're using three big buckets, where we're using encryption, identity, and authorization tied together. And the labels are applied, force the protection, and use the rights management policies to control and protect. The beautiful thing about this is that the policy stays with the documents and the emails independently of where they go. So once you've applied these and put the protections in place, no matter where they go, if someone puts them on a USB drive and goes to a different country and tries to open them, then of course the AIP policy is still going to be there. And even when it gets shared with other people. So that gives us the protection of the data that would be inside some of those applications. Now, of course, from advanced information protection, we obviously have some other components that are useful here. So why this is a good selling point: no server infrastructure required. It's in the cloud. It's built for mobile devices. We can do tracking and verification and classification and labeling. Now, of course, I can hear the question in my head. Well, that's great. That's Word documents. That's PowerPoints. That's the PDFs that we don't care about. What about like actual data? Is there a way for us to protect data itself? Maybe stuff that's inside the service. Well, of course there is. And from there, we're going to be using things like Azure Active Directory policies, which I was going to walk you through and show you, to protect data that would be leaving the organization that would be related to services and components within the system itself. So the final question would be, how do you protect from malicious attacks? And I should kind of change that, because it probably doesn't necessarily need to be whether it's malicious attacks. I think really it should just be just any type of attacks. But how do we protect from those attacks? Well, firstly, if we look at those, the number one for me is use out-of-the-box security controls. Every single organization I've ever gone into which has had a problem, they haven't utilized the out-of-the-box security controls. So use them. They're there. I mean, actually, I spoke with a client recently, and I went in to check a few things, and they said, oh, yeah, we've been looking at the audit logs. And I was like, are you sure? And they said, yeah. And when I logged in, they hadn't, because they hadn't enabled the audit logs at all. It was still waiting to be enabled. So, use the out-of-the-box security controls that are there. Don't ignore Azure Active Directory. If you're functionally trying to protect access to data, because of course, if I apply protection policies in email, if I use data loss prevention, if I use all these other components, then what about things like Microsoft Graph? How do I get, can I get access to it that way? Well, of course, the good thing about things like Microsoft Graph is you can't just execute Microsoft Graph and get whatever you want. It's always in the context of you and based on the permissions that you would have, which would be user.read, for example. But that can be changed. You can ring fence, you can control. You can go in and create app registrations and say, I want to apply, this specific permission within Exchange or OneDrive or SharePoint, and then apply that together. I'm actually working on a project right now where I'm creating Azure functions that call into Office 365, and we use Azure app registrations to protect what I can get to. And it's an important step, because then I can provide a document back that says my application that utilizes Azure functions and utilizes the Microsoft Graph can only get access to A, B, and C. That's it. There's no functional way I can get to anything else. And then, of course, if they're worried, they can then apply other policies. So utilize mobile device management also. That's there to protect your mobile devices. So if you have bring your own device policy, put some policies in place if you don't want them connecting, or if you do, then sandbox them, or if you have on devices that you issue, then apply those. And then for me, reviewing cloud app security is number one, because once you have that enabled, it will tell you all those little things that you didn't know. You know, such and such account has already been compromised. I actually went through this with a client the other day. I went through their cloud app security logs to have a look. And sure enough, I saw 3 accounts that had been logged into from Nigeria and were successful. And they had no idea. And so instantly that causes alarm bells. We then go through and put a bunch of governance in place, protect the accounts. But then you'll be able to build a picture of what's been going on. Okay. So some resources for you.
Hey, Liam, real quick before you jump into that, we've got a question around AIP encryption and discovery. So Kevin is asking, does it break e-discovery and search in SharePoint?
So right now, yes. It doesn't break it. Because it's encrypted and stuff, it can't do anything with it. But Microsoft did talk about that they were going to get around that, which sounds really weird when I say it out loud. If you know what I mean, like that just sounded a little bit strange. Like they're going to get around it. That means they know how to get the content. No, but they are talking about a way of at least exposing some of the information, even if it's the metadata properly and things like that, instead of it just being flagged and going, I can't do anything with it. So that's their process right now. They were trying to work on that, but nothing that I know of right now. But it still does cause an issue.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think that covered it, yeah.
Is that the Keith Ritchie?
It is the one and only Keith Ritchie raising his hand and giving you a smiley face.
Oh, Keith, I am so honored. It's been so long. But yes. Okay. So outside of all of that, before I go to the resources, which is just a bunch of links. So here's some links. You can obviously go through and look at those, but those are just shameless plugs to courses. And then a shameless plug to a white paper that I wrote for Microsoft, which you can go through. This is about digital transformation. So here's what it is. One of my biggest gripes about Microsoft documentation, and I can say this, is that the documentation is great if you just want to follow a bunch of steps. If you want to go in and say, configure multi-factor authentication, step 1, boom, 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 boom. Step 2, dum, 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 dum. However, if you have a question that says, I have this many people in my organization and I want to know how to protect the data on their mobile devices and then block them from coming in when they're outside the US and they're traveling. Now, you could find the answer, but you would actually have to go through and look for all the stuff to figure that out. So the white paper is written a little bit differently. And what that does is it answers questions like that. There's some questions that me and Bill Bear came up with as questions that we've been asked, and then we answered those questions. So shameless plug there, but I thought it was a pretty good write. But that's just me. If you guys hate it, don't tell me. But I thought it was okay.
No feedback required.
Yeah, that's right. I don't need feedback for that. Bill said it was good, so I'm okay. So what's the action plan for you guys then? So action plan, number 1, enable multi-factor authentication. So 2 different ways of doing this. Historically, Microsoft pushed you to do user multi-factor. So basically select the accounts and click the multi-factor option, whether you're in 365 and you click multi-factor or go to Azure AD and then go to the accounts and click multi-factor, it makes no difference. But actually best practice isn't to do that now, unless you really, really want to. That's historically how we would do it in Office 365. The best practice is actually the last one now, which is conditional access. So force multi-factor using conditional access instead. But you can still do both. But number 1, multi-factor authentication. I don't care how you get it in there. I don't care what you use, whether you use, a third-party vendor or something else. Get multi-factor in, because that will be the first stopping block to anything that happens. Number 2, implement data loss prevention, whether that's regular across the unified DLP, across Exchange, Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, or whether it's just inside PowerApps and things like that. And then, of course, conditional access policy is also number 1. Those, for me, are the 3 big things that everybody who has 365 or is even contemplating going to should implement from day 1. I had this long debate the other day with a client of mine, and I did an audit on their environment, and the argument was all around multi-factor authentication. and they were more concerned about people being able to get to the data in the SharePoint site than multi-factor. And they the irony in that conversation of that multi-factor would protect that, and that then we would use other things. But these are the three big things. And of course, obviously what's been recent is obviously the whole passwordless thing. I use a key thing that I put into there, and I use the multi-factor app as well, the Azure app on my phone and my watch as well. So try and get away from people having to remember stuff, because you know what they do. They write them on sticky notes and stick them on the screens and things like that too. Okay, so there's my details. I'm going to say thank you, and then we'll just stop. And if you have questions, then we can answer more questions. I'm good with that.
So I've got one that sort of takes us up to a higher level. The balance always seems to be between what people feel they're getting out of, not what they're actually getting out of, what they perceive they're getting out of these security controls versus the difficulty and challenge of actually setting up and managing them. So how do you advise people to walk that balance, and what do they need to do to get that balance right?
That's perfect. That is the constant battle, is the ease and convenience versus security, and the perceived notion that when you apply security, it actually makes it much more complicated. And I do agree, though, that there is extra management that needs to go into that. And I've had lots of arguments. I'm going to say arguments because that's what they really are, with security teams about why it's not a bad thing. But there's a balance really, which comes around it's easier sell now to do things like multi-factor, which historically has been one of the pain points for most organizations. Like, let's use a real world example. So I'm working with an organization. I go and speak to the IT team. They're all like, most of them are, young in their careers. They're on their phones all the time. They're texting each other. They use social media. They take pictures of themselves while they're in the bathroom. The kind of people I'm talking about. It's like, take selfies while I'm in there. That kind of thing. And then on the flip side of it, I go into the finance department, and it's Sue. And Sue's like, she's about to retire. She don't care. Like, she has a password on a sticky note for everybody to see on the screen. And then security comes in and like, I come in and say, multi-factor across the board. And you're like, well, how the hell do we do that? Like, how are we going to cater for that? And I think going forward, things will change a little bit because consumer services now force this. So multi-factor things like Facebook and Instagram and things like that now. So it becomes less of an argument now and more so of just enable it. And Microsoft have done a great job, if we're talking multi-factor, to try and make this as easy as possible, like as painless at least, by using the apps or whatever else and things like that. So there's no silver bullet, but I think it's an easier conversation now, especially when I start the conversation out and say, you don't want to be like the IT guy from Target. For example, when they had the massive breach or any other organization. So it becomes an easier conversation.
Do you find yourself, when you're talking to clients, especially some of the larger ones, as asking, well, where's your Office 365 security administrator? And nobody answers that question.
Yes. Yeah. Because so weirdly had that conversation literally like the other day, and I ended up getting on a phone call and I said, can I speak to the Office 365 administrator with SharePoint? And they were like, yes. And then there was like 5 people on the phone. And it was weird because none of them were actually the administrator. Like, a couple of them were like in the security team, and some of them were in the IT team. And actually, no one really knew who did what. But this was the pain point. They were all global admins. But none of them knew what to do at all. They had no idea. Like, it was so bizarre. And I'm like, so who is it that makes these changes? Well, he does. Well, does he know what he's doing? And it was like those and they were like, I didn't do it. it was like those conversations. And so there's not always a designated administrator, and there's not always a designated owner. So that's that. So it's weird because Microsoft have pushed for years to have these security administrators and security teams and everything else. And the problem is, like, I'm fighting this with a global organization right now where they actually have a SharePoint admin team, and then you have security team. and they don't get along. Like, so SharePoint wants to put something in and security say no, and then we have this. So it works. Yeah, it's not even good the other way. So really what it should just be one person. Like, you are the admin. If it breaks, it's on you. That's what it should be. No, I'm just joking.
And an admin and a backup when that person gets hit by.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, eventually it'll be AI anyway, so it doesn't matter. Like, it'll just be, you know.
All right, so I'm going to quickly just reshare back our slides earlier. I was looking at the recording metrics actually, and noticed that it looks like it cut off the beginning of our presentations here. So I'm just going to real quick thank our sponsors again by jumping back into our slides here. We can't do these events without them. And yes, for those who are wondering, we are still working on another in-person event. K2 has generously offered to sponsor that, so I'm working it out with Joe Picardo. We're going to do something really cool. We just don't know what that is yet, so that is TBD, but we will definitely be getting together in person again soon. And Gary, SharePoint is at your nearest location that serves beverages of your choice. So we will all toast with you virtually. Again, thanks also to our gold sponsors, TrippLite, Ampio, Yash, and SparkHound. Video is available on our channel, which I posted earlier. And if you did not get that, I will have that posted up on our website here in just a few minutes after this is done. So you can go out and see the videos. This video recording will be available in about a week or so. We'll have that up, and you will get a notification when the video is available. Quick reminder on the upcoming events. Here's the quick slide for that, so you can see the links and the URLs for those that are upcoming. And then I posted throughout the chat a bit earlier the links that are on our news slide here. We have uploaded this to the handouts section if you would like to get a hold of the deck. Don Kirkham said he had some troubles in another browser. It seems like Chrome is the only browser that really works effectively across everything. I will reach out to the platform provider and find out why there are issues on other browsers. Although anyone using, I think Don called it Edgium or Chrome Explorer or Chrome, whatever Microsoft is calling that new Frankenstein thing they've created. That's not really ready for prime time yet. I'm not sure that's what we should be using to access this kind of stuff, and I can't really blame BigMarker for not supporting that one yet. But you would assume if it works in Chrome, it works there, but obviously that is an incorrect assumption. Don likes it because it's fast. Nothing shows up, but it's fast. All right, so once again, thank you to Liam for putting this together for us and suffering through our technical issues in the beginning. Greatly appreciate that. Liam, do you have your slide deck out on SlideShare anywhere?
I don't at the moment, but I mean, I can, and then I can send you a link.
Yeah, if you would, post that out to your platform of choice. Send me a link. We'll get that updated on the website. For those who may not have looked at the website in a while, you can always go into our previous meetings and you can see the information about the meeting. And I often, when our speakers supply them, we'll post links to the presentations there. So feel free to do that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us again this month. And we hope to see you next month at our very next webinar. And Liam, I'm not sure when I'll see you again, but hopefully sometime soon, somewhere around the world.
Indeed. It's normally somewhere not here.
It usually is. This tends to be the case. So we'll go ahead and put an end to this one. Again, thank you, Liam, to my fellow co-conspirators, Chris Webb and Paul McCollum, who joined us today, along with Corey Roth, who was here. We just couldn't hear him. For a while, we saw him, but he was here. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you next time.